Imperfects presents a very special episode. Sit back, relax, and grab yourself your own cup of vulnerability. This is the Vulnerabilitea House. Okay, we are back. Oh, feels good, doesn't it?
What voice is that?
Oh, I don't know. I just sort of feel like that music just gets me.
Oh,
Just,
okay.
Gets
Gotcha.
me.
Gotcha.
We're in like this sort of the tea house.
We are in the tea house.
Yeah, to give you credit, like I've never actually started an episode like that. It was quite weird in hindsight, like looking back on it.
I see what you're trying to do, and I like it. It was like a very calming.
Yeah. Was it calming though?
No, it's a little bit weird. That's okay.
The opposite.
Well, we're back in the Vulnerabilitea House, obviously, and today, really, really exciting.
Yeah.
Really exciting. And now, Hugh, this is essentially you've invited our guest, so I'll leave it to you to.
Yeah, we have kind of gone down this path of we've been individually inviting guests and then sort of bringing them to the tea house. So
yeah,
I am very excited today to introduce and also to welcome Dr Yves Rees to the Vulnerabilitea House. First of all, welcome to you, Yves, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here drinking tea and being vulnerable with you all.
Yeah.
I just realised I forgot to get the tea.
I know. I mean, Eve's doing a far better job of creating the theatre than we are of the tea house.
Well, it's too late for us to get tea, but that's okay. Thank you, Eve, for playing your part. We need to lift in the tea. Have I got water? I've got water. That'll have to do for now.
It's just like cold, bland tea you've got.
It is. Before we go any further, I might give a small introduction, and we've recently started writing up our introduction, so I hope you don't mind me just reading from my laptop for a second. Dude, now should I call you Eve or Dr. Eve? Or Dr. Rees?
Well, really, you should call me Professor at all times.
Oh,
no.
Professor. There you go. Okay.
No. Eve is totally fine. Like Doctor is my professional title, but, in day-to-day life, I just go by Eve, and all my students call me Eve as well. So that's totally great.
If it's all right, if you're not going to take the doctor role, can I be doctor today? Can I?
Well, I might have to examine your PhD first to see if you're up to scratch. Have you got it ready?
Yeah. No. Yeah. It's hang on. I haven't got it. I'll grab it. I've definitely got it. It's at home somewhere in the bloody mess, but I'll definitely show it to you. Let's just do doctor next time.
Okay. Okay. So, just a bit of introduction. Dr. Yves Rees is a writer, historian and podcaster. At present, Yves is a lecturer in history at Trobe University in Melbourne and a co-host of Archive Fever podcast, which Josh loves his history. Ryan, are you a history fan?
I don't dislike history. I just don't know much about it.
Okay.
It'd be a strange thing to dislike history.
Yeah.
I just don't like history.
Unless I'm just like super Eckhart Tolle and it's like I only deal in the present.
Anyway, I'll continue because I've got plenty more to go here. Eve was the recipient of the 2020 Calibre Essay Prize, awarded for their essay, Reading the Mess Backwards. Their memoir, All About Eve, Notes from Transition, was published in August of this year. Congratulations. A huge congratulations for that, by the way.
Thank you.
And I've already explained to you before this podcast, I haven't read it yet because I just thought it'd make me feel a little bit insecure about my own book, writing my own book, so I will get to it. Eve is transgender and uses they, them pronouns. Eve writes on transgender history and politics and volunteers with Transgender Victoria. Alongside Sam Elkin, Eve is the co-founder of Spilling the Tea, trans writing collective, which was a finalist for Artist of the Year at the 2021 Globe Awards. So,
were you reading that?
Just pull it off the tongue.
Nervous. It sounded natural.
Yeah, it's just like it's a normal conversation.
I reminded myself of, I used to be a primary school teacher. I reminded myself as when you get kids to read out the books they're reading. Didn't really flow, did it?
That's
Sorry,
right.
Eve, sorry.
All good.
No worries. Thanks for that introduction.
Yeah, and big fan of history, but this isn't what we've got you in here to do today. This is an episode of the Vulnerabilitea House. I mean, I don't know, maybe you are going to talk about history in your answer, but I'm going to present to you 3 questions for those
cards.
of you they're on the cards. For those of you who are new to the Vulnerabilitea House, maybe you're a big fan of Yves, and so you're listening to us having no idea what this is about. We present 3 questions that come up sort of randomly on cards. The idea was that we would get them professionally made up, but last minute, leaving the house one day, I forgot. It was my job. I forgot to do it. So we got sticky notes and we stuck them on Bluey cards. So I've got 2 kids who are really into Bluey. So the whole lot of Bluey cards, and there's Post-it notes on there. So I'm going to pull out 3 cards, yeah. Eve. It's very professional.
I mean, the work it took to stick all the Post-it notes on every card, I mean, it would have just been easier. Yeah.
It's a very good point. But so, Eve, are you ready to go? If I
I'm poised.
pull
Yeah, I'm
3
good.
cards out of the... Okay. So here we go. So here are your 3 questions. Happy to repeat them if you want to take your time to choose your question. But here are the 3 questions for you. Question number 1. Question number 1. What was your biggest fear as a young person?
Mm-hmm.
That's question number 1. Question number 2. What is something that it took you too long to learn?
That's a great question.
And question number 3. When have you felt most alone in your life? They're pretty full-on questions you've drawn there.
Wow.
Just a bit of light chat over the non-existent tea.
Yeah, a casual chat with 3 guys you've never met before.
Well, I could answer all those questions, but I think I'm going to have to go with number 2 about, what it took me too long to learn.
Oh my God, yeah.
Very good. Okay. Okay, now, are you feeling ready to start? Are you comfortable? I feel like it's such a...
I feel like we've really just gone straight into the questions, and we probably should have had some just polite chat before about how you're going.
Yeah, apologies, Eve.
Yeah, but...
That's okay. I'm all about, just being radically honest and putting yourself out there. I have just written a memoir after all, so I've got pretty good at putting it all out into the world. I
guess it's been your world for the last year, hasn't it?
Yeah, and what I've actually realised is that, it's a bit of a truism about vulnerability, but, it gets less scary the more you do it, and because you realise that no one who's worth your time actually ever rejects you or mocks you or laughs at you when you're vulnerable. Like everyone actually craves vulnerability, and everyone praises you for it. So, that's my,
so true.
That's my, hot tip. If you want to get, intimacy and love and connection, is be more vulnerable, because it's really a fast track to all the best things in life.
That's amazing.
I've totally drunken the vulnerability Kool-Aid, and I'm all about it.
Or tea.
Yeah. Or the tea. That was, I saw what you did there. That was good.
Yeah, it's just a shameless attempt to plug the show that we're doing right now. So no point.
I was thinking it's all quite, it's quite apt for me to be on this show because, as you mentioned in the intro, I created with my friend and collaborator, Sam Elkins, Spilling the Tea as a trans writing collective. Same kind of pun, because that's a kind of double entendre, because as you might know, in like queer and trans circles, the tea means like the truth or the gossip. So when someone says, I'm spilling the tea, I'm sharing what's really going on, like we're getting down to business here. But it's also a double entendre because in transmasculine circles that I exist in, we use the word tea as a shorthand for testosterone. So when we say spilling the tea, it's a reference to the fact that many of us, including myself, take testosterone as part of our gender affirmation treatment. So, there's just tea has so many multiple meanings in this conversation. It's all going on.
So you sorry, you must have, I was just going to say, you must have been pretty rapt when you came up with that name for the podcast then.
Yeah. It's just meant to be.
Well, I was going to say that your pun is just a lot better than ours. Sorry, Ryan. That's just it's so many more layers.
Yeah. All right, Eve, that's all we've got time for.
My work here is done. I've shamed you all.
Yeah, you've completely outpunned us. Very good.
Okay, so let's back to the question. So the question, just to refresh.
The question that Eve is going to answer is, what is something that took you too long to learn?
So the thing that took me too long to learn was the fact that I am transgender. So I think in retrospect that I was born trans. I was someone who was assigned female at birth, which just essentially means that I came out of the womb with like female genitals with a vulva, and the doctor said it's a girl, as happens to half the population. So that's that was the story I was told growing up, and like many of us, I accepted that story without question. And it wasn't till I was 30 years old, which was 3 years ago, in 2018.
Oh, wow.
I'm 33 now, that I finally realized that that I wasn't a girl or a woman, that I was trans. I'm not a trans man or a binary trans person. I call myself a non-binary trans masculine person who uses they, them pronouns. But but I'm certainly not a woman. And, to be honest, as someone who has 3 degrees and spent 10 years at university, it's kind of bloody embarrassing in a way that it took me so long to realize this really basic fact about myself. What was I doing all that time?
do you have you spent much time like thinking about if there even is a why or needs to be, but have you spent much time thinking about why it took you till you were 30? Like, is there a reason?
There's so many reasons. Look, I think that, to put it bluntly, I think the biggest reason is that the world is really transphobic and really doesn't like trans people, and, kind of sends out all these messages that even little kids can pick up on, that it's like really not okay to be trans. And so when I was born in Melbourne, but I spent most of my childhood in Newcastle in the 90s and early 2000s. And, Newcastle, great beaches, great weather. But back then it was like a pretty conservative, monocultural place, it was not okay to be gay or, to be Asian or, anything outside the so-called normal when I was growing up there, let alone be trans. So, when I was a little kid, I just didn't really even know being trans was a thing that you're allowed to be. And when I first saw that represented in the world, the representations I saw were so hostile. Like I've been thinking a lot in the last few years about, what were the first representations I saw of transness as a kid. And I realized that probably one of the earliest ones was the film Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, with Jim Carrey, that comedy. Yeah, which I imagine, you would have seen. So, it came out in 1994 and it was a huge hit. Like, I loved it. Everyone loved it. Probably saw it a dozen times.
All of it was one of my favorite films. And now that I've realized that, all of the dialogue around that is just coming to my brain. And I'm like,
I can't remember any of it. What was it?
It's like, I don't want to take your thunder, Eve, but it's.
Yeah. Well, so basically Jim Carrey, lead character, is a pet detective. He's, finds out things that happens to pets. And so he's solving this kind of crime. But essentially the baddie in the story is a trans woman who has done all these horrible, horrendous deeds and deceived all these people. And the climax of the story is her being exposed as a trans woman because she's someone who passes as a woman. And so there's this climactic scene when Jim Carrey strips her naked and reveals that she still has a penis. And everyone is so revolted and disgusted. There's a scene also because at an earlier point in the movie, Jim Carrey and this trans woman, they kiss, and then Jim Carrey, when he later realizes he's kissed a trans woman, he's so overcome with revulsion that he convulsively vomits. And there's this really long sequence of him vomiting.
The montage.
And then trying to brush his teeth, to get all the contagion out. So of course, what that says to trans people in the making, like me, is being trans is physically revolting. Your existence causes people to vomit in disgust.
That is so fascinating. I mean, that film, I always think about that film I mean, obviously for other reasons, but quite formative for me in comedy. You know, like it's like Jim Carrey. Like I was probably 19 or 18 when that came out, so I was like right in the hitting zone for that film, and I just loved it so much. But it's so. I mean, now I'm just thinking about all the films, all the different films.
Yeah, I've got quite a few come to mind as well. Just in that. Yeah, my God.
And so how I was a lot younger. To Eve's point of being
Josh is 12.
Yeah, not now. Yeah. I've got. And to your point before, you said about how little kids pick up on all the signals. It's so funny that I have this like visceral memory of a kid of seeing that reveal and it being such a like the feeling of like it's a bad thing and a nasty thing and that person's really bad and evil.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And it was intertwined with the character as well. So it's not just the way, I feel like not just the way that Jim Carrey and everyone reacts, but the fact that it's the bad, evil person in the story.
Totally. Like there was a really great documentary that came out on Netflix last year and it's still there called Disclosure, which was a really great like documentary history of how trans people have been depicted in films and TV over the last century. Wow. And what that shows is that there's this double layer that you picked up on, that trans people are disgusting, like they cause people to vomit, but they're also always the baddies. They're like the murderers, the people who are deceiving and lying and killing. So like they're people to be grossed out by, but they're also people to fear. Is
it sort of like almost a thing of like, because I mean, having written a few things, when you're thinking about a villain, you want to think of like a character trait that is sort of like what's untrustworthy about them or what's suspicious about them. And clearly, like in years gone by, that's probably a character trait that, the writers of Ace Ventura goes like, well, okay, well, this woman can seemingly be fine and normal, but let's show them why she's not.
Yeah, totally. That's so correct. That idea that trans people are villains is linked to this idea that trans people are lying, that they're just inherently deceitful because they're hiding who they really are from the world, which it's important to stress is not true, because a trans woman is a woman. Like, she's not a man who's pretending to be a woman. She's someone who was born with a body that led people to mistakenly think she was a man, but is actually really a woman. So she's not hiding anything. But that's
an interesting distinction.
Yeah, that was certainly the idea that came about for a really long time, and has a really big purchase in the history of TV and movies.
Yeah, Eve, I was just wondering, when you watched that, and maybe you were going to go on to this anyway, and we've just gotten a bit on a digression, but were you aware at a level that resonated with you, were you aware that you were trans at that stage in any way and made the link?
And how old were you as well at that time?
So I would have been 6 years old when the film came out.
Oh, okay.
So pretty young. As I sort of mentioned before, I never consciously knew I was trans until I was 30. It wasn't like some trans people definitely, they know when they're like, 3 or 4, and they just, they don't tell anyone because they know, it'll make life hard for them or they won't be loved or accepted. That's true of some people, but it wasn't true of my experience. I think, in retrospect, what happened, and, various like psychologists who specialize in gender have kind of agreed with me on this, is that, little kids, because really little kids are so dependent on adults in their world to survive. Like, they can't live on their own. We're so vulnerable as little kids that they get really, really good at picking up kind of unconsciously the roles they're meant to play to be accepted and loved and safe. And I think that's what happened to me, that I really, really early picked up, before I've kind of have conscious memories, that I was told I was a girl, and that meant I was meant to live and act and identify in certain ways. And, I was a pretty anxious kid. I was a pretty clingy kid. So I just think my kid brain was like, well, I've just got to follow the rules and do what everyone tells me just to stay safe, because it's too risky to do anything else. So I just became the total little good girl. I really, was very good at like performing the role of girl and later woman, and was like a very kind of obedient child generally. But I think another thing to point out on that is that when you're like a prepubescent kid, it's often not such a big issue, because like little girls' bodies and little boys' bodies are like not that different, and they often get to act pretty much the same, and there isn't the big like gender divide that kind of emerges in puberty. So for me as a little kid, it wasn't such a big like struggle to have to pretend to be a girl as a little kid, because it just was like, oh yeah, whatever, like I'll just pretend to be like my older brother and copy him and want to be him, and and kind of I could ignore the fact that I was told I was a girl. It wasn't that like present. But for me, and I think for many trans people, that really changed when I hit puberty, and which coincided with the first years of high school, because all of a sudden like I grew breasts and I got my period, and I had I developed hips and curves and all these embodied like markers that kind of meant I couldn't forget that my supposed womanness, that they were just kind of constantly in my face. And that's when things really, really went downhill for me. Like even then I still didn't kind of consciously know that the feeling I was having was gender dysphoria, and I didn't consciously think of myself as trans. But from puberty, I was so uncomfortable in my body. Like I just couldn't stand my breasts, hated getting my period. And I developed, as is really common among trans youth, I developed a really bad eating disorder as a teenager, because, I essentially wanted to be as thin as possible as a way to be as androgynous as possible. Because, then like the fat that caused my breasts to grow would disappear, and when you lose a certain amount of body fat, your periods normally stop, so you can forget that you have reproductive capacity. And it was all like my really restrictive diet and obsessive exercise, which continued for many, many years, was really for me a way to kind of strip away my supposed womanness and kind of go back to this much easier androgyny of earlier childhood, where I felt much comfortable in my body.
Am I right in thinking that I'm not sure, I can't quite figure out, I think you're about the same age as my girlfriend. She's 33.
Yeah, I'm 33. Same age.
Yeah. So she's often sort of spoken about like when she was at school, like the kind of fashion, like not the fashion, but like the trend at least, was that sort of androgynous looking model. Like that, and that was actually a way for a lot of younger girls to kind of hide behind that trend, who if they had an eating disorder of some sort, because it was like the sort of like Mary Kate Ashley Olsen sort of like baggy clothes, really kind of androgynous look. And I don't know whether that was like a factor in your school days or anything like that.
No, definitely. It was like that time in the early 2000s was like peak this time where the female beauty ideal was like super, super, super skinny. It's like Paris Hilton, like Keira Knightley at her thinnest. It was a time of like low cut jeans and crop tops. So you wanted to have like a super flat stomach. And so I think what that beauty ideal did for me was enable me to not realize again that I was trans, because I could kind of like my behavior kind of made sense as female behavior, because it was just like, well,
you could rationalize
this person, like I'm a girl, and well, I've been told I'm a girl, and that, pretty girls are meant to be really thin, and I'm trying to be really thin. So this is just all totally normal, like normal teenage girl activity. So I think like that was another factor that like caused, me to be so delayed and kind of belated in realizing my transness, because it did kind of all make sense in terms of the kind of the feminine norms and the beauty norms of the time, definitely.
And so you said before that when you reached puberty, your things spiraled for you. Went downhill for you. Are you referring to your mental health at that point? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, my mental health definitely. It's hard because obviously like a lot of kids have a really tough time in puberty and, a tough time in high school for lots of different reasons. But yeah, it was really a pretty miserable time in my life. Go on.
No, so I'm just trying to picture like a school kid at a high school in Newcastle trying to trying to work through in your mind all the stuff that is still difficult to understand, I guess, for a lot of people. And you're trying to stay connected to social groups. You're trying to not to stand out, all that kind of stuff. You're going through all this inner turmoil. And like, how much time do you spend thinking about it? Are you walking around school thinking about it all day, or do you sort of park it and try and pretend it's not happening, or how do you deal with that mentally?
I think my mental coping strategy was to kind of try and suppress all my angst around my body and my gender by living in my brain. I mean, I think, you know, as we've discussed, I'm an academic. I have a PhD. I've spent my entire adult life in universities. That's not unrelated to my gender, because when you focus on academic work and academic success, you start to identify yourself just with your brain and your intellect, and your body becomes less relevant. And that's, in retrospect, that is 100% what I did. Like, I became I became so fixated on academic achievement in high school, like really, really driven, really, really motivated, because it became like a safe place for me. It was a safe place where I could escape from my body, all the confusion I had about it, like all these like awful discomfort and sense of feeling trapped in my body, which I now know is gender dysphoria. I had no language for it at the time. Like, no one was talking about gender dysphoria. So it just was this kind of overwhelming, confluence of sensation. So to escape that as a kid, not having the tools to deal with it, I was just like, I'm just going to study really hard and get 100% on this maths test and get an A+ on this essay. And that's how I'll feel safe and control in the world.
Control sounds like a really big part of it too, doesn't it?
Totally,
that ability to, there's no betrayal or no lies, no nothing. It's just like, my intellect is true. Does that make sense?
Yeah. My intellect felt like something orderly that I could like know and trust and use, like kind of to harness to get things I wanted in the world. Whereas my body,
and develop a really strong identity linked with that.
Exactly. And and get status and respect. Whereas my body just felt like a space of messiness and betrayal, and I just didn't want to go there. So I think I was really disassociated from my body. I was just kind of trying to pretend it didn't exist as much as possible.
Wow.
So look, so I guess hopefully, like, I mean, this is incredible. Thank you so much. Hopefully this will be like a thing that someone will listen to that is sort of like 20-year-old you, and it will trigger something in them or help them come to some realization about themselves. Like, hopefully that will be the case. But was there something for you that you like, or I guess the question is like, what was the thing? Or was there one thing?
How did I finally realize?
Yeah. Did you go like one? Was there like one day where we were like, oh, you were watching, like, for me, not for me, but like I remember watching Transparent. The show Transparent. I think this would be similar for a lot of people, and that was like the first time I'd really watched something in the mainstream, at least, about transgender community or the process of transitioning, other than like, and that was like pre Caitlyn Jenner, which is what a lot of people might be introduced. So was there something for you that was a moment in time or a thing that you saw or heard?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was really related to that quite dramatic increase in trans representation that took place in the late 2010s that Transparent was a really big part of. So there's this phrase that's often thrown around in trans circles called the trans tipping point. This idea that there was a kind of a moment around 2014, 2015, when suddenly the kind of the Ace Ventura style representation of trans people as like weird, freakish deviants gave way to the more humane and like trans-led types of representation that we see in TV shows like Transparent. So there was a whole bunch of things that came out around the same time. There was Transparent. There was Orange is the New Black, which has, Laverne Cox as a trans actress playing a trans character. There was The Danish Girl, that film about Lily Elbe, one of the first trans women to undergo gender affirmation surgeries. And there was also like lots of like novels. There was Caitlyn Jenner, you know, more recently. We've had a lot of other trans celebrities come out, like Elliot Page. So there's really, in the last kind of 5 to 6 years, been a real cultural moment where transness has hit the mainstream. And that did have a really huge impact for me. I really think that was key in allowing me to finally recognize myself. You know, we often say that you can't be what you can't see. And I hadn't been able to be trans for my life because I hadn't seen any like humane, normal, you know, accessible trans people. The only trans people I'd seen were like freaks and deviants. And I knew I wasn't a freak and a deviant. So it really did take seeing like ordinary trans people, both kind of saying that you could be trans and fully human, but also talking about their experience in detail. So I could hear people talk about gender dysphoria and that sense of being trapped in your body and feeling so uncomfortable in your body, and be like, oh, that sounds like a lot like the experience I've been having in my body since puberty. And I thought that was just normal, and I thought everyone had that. But it turns out, it turns out that's a distinct trans experience. So there was a couple of, go on, sorry.
Oh, no, you might go onto it, but I was just going to ask, when you started seeing those representations and it started to click for you and ring a bell, that's familiar, was that a good feeling, or was it a scary feeling, or was it both? Or
yeah, that's a great question. So I suppose it took a few years for that all to come together. Like there was, you know, probably about 2 years when I just finished my PhD. I just ended a long-term relationship, so I was kind of newly single for the first time, trying to work out, you know, the next part of my life, and I was consuming all this culture and seeing myself more and more. But then there was one day where it actually just crystallized for me, and I fully appreciated I was trans. I was in Canada. I'd been there for a conference for work in Vancouver, and I had like a holiday booked to take advantage of being in Canada after the conference. And so I was in Victoria, which is the capital of BC, and they just legalized marijuana in the province. And I was like, oh, I'm on holidays. I'm gonna have a good time with this. So I took some THC pills, which I, you know, don't normally dabble in, you know, very much, if at all. And then the next morning I woke up, and in that kind of hazy moment when you're not fully awake, but you're not still asleep, I had this sentence that appeared in my brain, which is, "You're not a woman. Wearing women's clothes is drag." And in that moment, I just knew, like, that was it. It was like, it was almost, I mean, I'm not a religious person at all, but it felt like getting a message from God. Like it was that definite and solid.
Wow.
And I was just like, yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense. And that day, in that moment, I was so freaking happy. I was overjoyed.
Wow.
Because it explained everything.
Goosebumps.
It explained everything, like all the sense of torment in my body and discomfort and confusion and angst. I suddenly like understood what it had all been about, and I had a path forward. Like, because I used to get so depressed all the time, thinking my entire life was going to be this discomfort and misery. But now I knew I was trans. I could do something about it. It was so good.
There's a couple of things. So that's an amazing story. Amazing story. There's a couple of things that come to mind. One of the things that psychologists will often talk about with people with depression is people with depression will explain the way they feel as being trapped. That's often a thing of like, I have depression, I just feel trapped with, and it might be something very different to what you've experienced. It might be, you know, a life situation or whatever it is in a relationship, and that leads to depression that feels trapped. I'm guessing that would maybe, I'm sure for a while you potentially felt trapped. Am I right in saying that? Did you feel trapped in a certain situation, and then it was this happiness came from the feeling of, I'm actually not trapped anymore?
Yeah, completely. Like the way I often talk about it is like I'd been an actor trapped in the wrong role. Like I'd been cast in this role of being a woman in the play of life. And I'd been so trapped in it because it was the wrong role for me. And that moment when I realized it was trans, it was like I finally realized I didn't have to keep playing that role anymore. I could just walk off stage and no one would stop me, and it was fine. And I could play whatever role I wanted to play. It was this incredible moment of liberation. I actually went and got a tattoo that day to mark the mark the experience.
What's the tattoo?
Yeah, what's the tattoo?
It's on my wrist. It's a German phrase called Liebe die Fragen in German, or Live the Questions in English. It comes from the poet, a German poet called Rainer Maria Rilke, who wrote this famous letter to a friend of his who was experiencing a lot of like doubt and confusion. And Rainer Maria Rilke said, don't be too fixated on trying to find the answers and like have everything, locked down and fixed. Just try and live the questions and enjoy the questions themselves.
So good.
And I love that idea because, in that moment of waking up and realizing I wasn't a woman, I didn't actually know what else I was. I hadn't figured out then, am I like a trans man? Am I non-binary? Am I something else? I just knew I wasn't a woman. But getting that tattoo, Live the Questions, was me making a commitment to myself that I would follow this realization. I would follow this new idea and keep asking the questions and see wherever they led.
So, and I apologize if this is a crude question, but once you saw that sentence and you knew that you weren't a woman, did you then question like, well, then what am I?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, that's like been the journey of the next couple of years.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm not a woman, what am I then? Yeah. And I mean, like I said, that day itself was just like euphoric, really. But it didn't stay that way because, I came back to Australia a week or so later and, had to deal with like the reality of like, what does this mean for my life? How do I tell people? How do I, like, what do I do to transition? How do I socially transition? How do I medically transition? What am I transitioning to? And how do I figure that out? And that's really all been the like pretty intense journey of the last, 3 or so years.
I feel like, I mean, this is a vulnerability house, but I feel like it would almost be amazing to get you back for another type of episode we do, which is an Academy of Imperfection, which is where, I mean, it would be fascinating for you to essentially...
A first qualified lecturer, actually. A lecturer.
To sort of like run through the process of what, and maybe it's different for everyone, but like to run through the process of what to do. Because I imagine that would be such a scare. I mean, I guess there's lots you can look up. There would be infinite resources online. But that would be, I mean, I'm tempted to just ask you now, but just like how that, like what do you do? I mean, originally I was going to ask you on the day that you woke up and realized that, I mean, yes, you got a tattoo, but like, what else did you do? Like, what did you do that day? Like, what do you do that day? Like, honestly,
More
what
drugs.
did you do? More drugs. Where are those pills?
Well, I walked around. It was like it was a Sunday, and it was a really sunny, beautiful day in this like beachside town. So I just kind of like spent hours walking around, kind of like sitting in this realization. But then, as you've kind of alluded to, I was like, well, what the hell do I do now? So then in the afternoon, I went to a cafe which had free Wi-Fi because, of course, I was overseas, didn't have data on my phone. And I spent like 3 hours on Instagram looking up all these hashtags, being like, what is a trans man? What is trans? Like trying to figure out what the hell, what the hell it meant to be trans and what that could look like, and sort of look at my different options. And I mean, that was actually really profound. I mean, it's easy to, say that social media is trivial, but I think for trans people like me, the internet in general and social media in particular is often where we find our people, we feel less alone, and we are educated. Like we actually, get the facts about like, if you want to take hormones, how do you do that? If you want to get surgery, what does that look like? What are the different pronouns you can use? Social media is such an incredible resource for that. And
yeah. For all the shitness of Facebook, it is an amazing place for those really niche communities, like to be able to chat about things like that.
Totally.
We spend so much time focused on all the negative niche communities. You forget that there are so many wonderful niche communities on the internet.
Yeah, totally. I'd actually, at that point in 2018, I'd deactivated my Facebook account a few years earlier because, for all the obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But when I realized I was trans, I created a new account in my new name because I wanted to join all these communities, because I realized that all the online trans communities were using Facebook to organize, and it was actually a space.
Who was the first person you told?
Who was the first person I told? It was.
And was it a good experience?
No, it was not. Oh, actually, the first person I told, I think, was
The barista.
The barista, yeah.
No, it was kind of like an acquaintance in Canada, like a few days later that I caught up with. And I was so like, because I'd been alone for most of this time. And I was like,
Wow.
in this weird headspace of having this intense experience myself. And I'm
high off your head.
Basically. So I told a Canadian woman I kind of knew from the internet when I met up with her for coffee, and she was really supportive. But when I came back to Australia, the first person I told was my mum. And that was like, to be honest, a really, really difficult conversation. My mum is so on board with my trans identity these days. Like, she's my best friend and a super ally. But she was just like, I think a lot of parents and family members are, she was really fearful because she, all she knew about transness was like the Ace Ventura model of transness. So in her mind, it was a bad thing. Like, she didn't want her beloved child to experience this, unfortunate stigmatized identity. So I told her over dinner shortly after I came back from Canada. And it was one of those conversations where you have like a mental map of how it's going to go. Like, in my mind, she'd be like, "Oh, I love you. That's so wonderful. Let's hug. And, I'm always going to be there for you." But in reality, I sort of gave her this garbled explanation of what I thought I was. And she was like, "Are you telling me you want to be a man? What? You want to be a man?"
Yeah.
And she was horrified. She was frankly horrified.
Yeah.
And it was really, really tough. I think one of the other 3 questions you posed to me at the start of this conversation was, when had I felt most alone? And those months when I first came back from Canada, that was when I felt most alone, because I felt,
God, what a roller coaster.
I felt terrified. Like, the initial euphoria had worn off, and I was like, what the hell does this mean for my life? Am I really trans? Am I deluded? Was it all just an illusion? What's going on? And people in my life were confused as well. They were scared. They didn't really know how to best support me, because for them, it really came out of the left field. Like, I'd been good at playing the role of woman. I'd been good at impersonating that. So I hadn't been a kind of like butch, mask type presenting person. Like, I'd been a person who wore dresses and makeup and high heels. So
you played the role really well.
I played the role really well. Yeah, people in my life had no inkling it was all just a performance. So everyone was a bit freaked out, and understandably. But it did mean that I felt incredibly terrified and incredibly alone.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, you want to ask a question?
I was just going to ask you, playing a performance for 30 years has got to be very exhausting. Do you have more energy?
That is
mental energy.
That is such a perceptive question, and the answer is
so. Eve,
just before you answer it,
Josh has a reputation, not unfounded, for asking incredible questions, and so whenever someone says that's a good question, it's like I just can't go like,
not again.
He's always there. He's coming in,
and also,
it's a good thing I'm not on your camera because I'm going very red right now.
And also before that's that, I was thinking just then, gee, that must be so exhausting. But I thought, well, I can't just say that must be exhausting. That's not a question. So Josh is like, take into thought, turn into a fascinating question. So anyway, well, looking forward to your answer.
100%. That's right. Like, I used to think I was a really, really intense introvert because I found socializing so exhausting. And I mean, now, like, I think I still like lean introvert. Like, I still like spending a lot of time alone, but I like socializing so much more now than before because it takes less energy, because I'm not putting on a performance. I'm just much more comfortable in my own skin. I am just who I am. I don't need to kind of psych myself up to play this role that feels so fake. And it just makes life so much better. Like, I love hanging out with people more. And my life is a lot more full than it's ever been because I have more mental energy and more physical energy.
Wow. Yeah.
And I bet there's just the phrase, we all grow up hearing the phrase, just be yourself. Like that phrase, I guess, is probably a bit, probably now makes a lot more sense to you. Where you're like, oh, yeah, okay, yes, that's what I'm doing. I'm being myself.
Yeah, totally. But I think what I've also learned is that when that phrase, just be yourself, gets bandied about, like we act like that's a straightforward thing. Like you can do that without cost. And what I've learned is that, being yourself is definitely worth it. And it's the kind of the essential prerequisite to a fully realized, fully happy life. But it's not easy. Like that you will have to go against the grain. You will have to swim against the tide. People will get frightened and pissed off, and you will lose people to do that often. So it's not a straightforward exercise often, because people, being trans is still, it's a lot better than it was when I was a kid, but it's still a really misunderstood and stigmatized identity. It's, it's hard in many ways. So it definitely takes a lot of bravery to live as a trans person, even though the benefits really make it worthwhile.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I've no doubt people like yourself, but people like, Elliot Page and, Caitlyn Jenner, it's like that it is because you've written this book and because you're here that it is hopefully changing. And like in another 5 years, it won't be as much of a big deal even again, like it's amazing. It's just amazing, obviously, what you're doing, not the being yourself bit necessarily, but the writing a book about it, considering you only realized this 3 years ago. Like that is wild, that turn. I mean, to be able to come to terms with it personally and within your family and friendship group, and to deal with that, but then to also publicly tell the story is just incredibly beneficial to the world.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I guess I was really motivated by how important it had been to me to see trans culture. That's what allowed me to name myself as trans. So I suppose I was, motivated to write my memoir because I wanted to, return the favor in a sense. I wanted to put more trans culture out there and, hopefully allow other people to see themselves and feel validated, and to, provide a bit of a tool for people in their lives to better understand trans identities.
I can't help but bring it back to education, because that's where I spend so much of our time with the Resilience Project in schools. I was chatting to a principal the other day of a school here in Melbourne who I was asking about how the year's been and what's going on at the school, and he said it's been a wonderful year. He said, I've helped 3 kids transition their gender in year 11.
Wow.
And I just thought, it just made me so happy. And I'm interested to know, what would have that done to you as a 13-year-old, seeing a year 11 or hearing the story of that? Would have you had the realization then, or do you think it wouldn't have changed anything for you? Or would have it been just permission to be a bit more, that it's okay to not really know exactly where you feel or who you are?
Yeah, God, I feel a bit emotional, like even thinking about that, because I think it would have been huge for me. Like if I'd been, year 7, year 8 and seen an older kid in my school transition, I think it really could have changed everything for me. Because that was a real turning point in my life when I'd, gone from being a pretty like androgynous kid and getting away from that to, when I started high school, I had like a pretty short haircut and I was bullied for looking like a boy and things like that. And, and that's sort of the time when I was like, well, I need to start playing the role of girl better from now on. But I wonder if, instead of being bullied for looking like a boy, I'd seen someone older than me transition. I really think it could have been a sliding doors moment in my life, and things could have gone very differently.
I just hope so much that becomes something that, as soon as he told me that story, the first thing I thought is I want my kids to go to this school. Like I want them to see, maybe that's not the thing they're dealing with, but maybe it's just, it is totally fine. We were saying before about be yourself. It's often a lot harder. It's a lot easier said than done. But to see 3 people, 3 17-year-old kids go to the teachers and say, I want some help with this. What do I do?
Amazing.
The message to every other kid is that you be yourself, and that is what really counts, and that's the most important thing. So
completely.
And people like you are the reason. People like you are the reason that kids have the courage to do it these days. So you should feel unbelievably proud.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's the right word, but I don't want to sound patronising, but that's how I feel, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's probably also the more likely the parents are going to be listening to this. And I think that's also, I mean, I hope that that's also the thing that's going to, anyone who's still in the Ace Ventura world listening can hopefully these sorts of conversations and your book are the things that will, when their child does come to them and, express their feelings like this, it's not as big of a deal that it might have been 5 years ago or yesterday.
And that's already changing. Like I don't have kids myself, but, the kids I have in my life, like I see that, other kids in their primary schools are coming out as trans, and it's no big deal. Like it's, it really does seem like things are changing incredibly, incredibly quickly. And, and as you mentioned, Hugh, like that you want your kids to go to that school, because I think you picked up on an important point that that trans people benefit everyone, like that someone having the bravery to live their own truth, to be who they are, that kind of creates a ripple effect of permission around them, where, of course, not everyone around them is going to be trans. I mean, trans people are only ever going to be a minority of the population. But, we all have parts of ourselves that we feel a bit ashamed of, or a bit, embarrassed of, or struggle to express. And trans people honouring their truth create kind of freedom and permission for everyone to honour their own truth.
And also
Such
inspiration.
An incredible point.
It's huge inspiration.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that's why I really think, instead of demonizing trans people as a threat to society, we should really be celebrating them, because they help everyone.
Yeah. Well, Ryan's and I'm very conscious of your time, so I don't want to keep you for too much longer, but I think a really nice way to maybe round out the conversation would be, Ryan just brought up parents who listen to this. What would be I understand a parent reacting in a way that is negative, only because I think parents they become fearful of, what does this mean for my child? Are they going to struggle? How hard is it going to be? I don't want I catch myself all the time thinking I want my child's life to be as easy as possible, which is, I can think it, but I can't let them see that's what I'm doing. What is the best way for a parent to respond if a child comes to them? It may not be exactly your issue, but let's just take, wanting to transition. What would have you, and I'm not judging your mum's response at all, what would have you loved your mum to have said to you when you first came to her?
I think, for me, and, for probably every trans child or trans adult telling their parents who they are, what we want is love and affirmation. And I think the reason for that is it's an incredibly vulnerable thing to do, to acknowledge you are trans in a transphobic world. And no one does that lightly. It took me, as I said, until I was 30 to say I was trans. But for most people, there's research that's been done in Australia recently that suggests that the average time period from a trans person kind of realizing somewhere in their brain that they're trans to telling people about it is 8 years. So, like reactionary conservatives often like to, they spin this line that, being trans is just a fad. Like all the kids these days just, they like hear about it and they decide they're trans, as a new trend. That couldn't be further from the truth. Like the reality is no one vocalizes their transness lightly. No one does it just because it's like a passing thought. Even for kids, it's something that they would have thought about and sat with and known to be true in their guts before they take the enormous step of telling someone. So I would say, to parents, if your child or someone in your life tells you that, take it seriously. Like, don't trivialize it. Don't act like it's just something that popped into their head 5 minutes ago. Take it seriously and assure them that you love them and will love them no matter what. Because it's, we trans people are terrified of rejection. We're terrified of people in our lives leaving us when we say who we really are. And I think another thing that's important to stress, in the case of like actual children, declaring themselves to be trans, is that it's pretty low stakes in a way. Like I think, there can be a lot of moral panic about, the kids are all becoming trans and they're going to get these, surgeries and change their name and then they'll regret it all when they're an adult. What that narrative obscures is that no trans children get any surgeries at all. Like it just legally does not happen in Australia or anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so if a trans kid wants to affirm their gender, all that means is things like changing their name, changing their pronouns, having a different haircut, having a different clothes. And that's all really reversible. That's all pretty low stakes. It can be changed at any point. And it's just being creative and experimental. So I think, if a kid is trans or thinks they might be trans, like take it seriously. But also if you don't even take it seriously, like who cares if they want to play with their gender and their gender expression in different ways, because it doesn't really matter. Like it's not harming anyone. They're just getting to try on different identities. And that's great for any kid.
Can I, did you change your name?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Is your name, can I ask how you chose your name?
Yeah. I have a chapter about this in my book. It was quite a journey. I spent a lot of time on baby name websites. Because where do you go when you try to rename yourself? My birth name was Anne, and I initially thought I would want like another name that started with A so I could have the same initial. Mm-hmm. But I went through all the male names under A, like, over a very long process over several months, and I kind of just didn't like any of them. And then I hit on Eve kind of just by accident. And I just liked how it sounded. I liked that it was a bit gender ambiguous, that that my Eve with the spelling Yves is a French masculine name. But when you say it, it sounds the same as EVE, the feminine. So for like a non-binary transmasculine person like me, I really like the way it kind of has all these multiple kind of meanings and connotations. So it just really worked for me.
Better than Mike or something.
Yeah. I didn't really I considered like Barry or Shane but I didn't think they quite worked for me.
Eve's perfect. Well, Eve, wow, that was just so informative, and
it was a combination of our three formats. That's what it was.
It really was.
It wasn't just a vulnerability.
It really was.
House.
It was the trifecta. We rarely get the trifecta. That was the trifecta.
Well, I try my best.
Eve,
well, you certainly delivered.
A+ again.
Yeah, A+.
I know. I may be trans now, but I haven't lost the impulse to get an A+ on everything.
That'll be there forever.
So your book, All About Eve, out now.
Yep.
I cannot wait to read it.
Yeah, me too.
It sounds like it's going to be incredible. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute delight spilling the tea with you all.
And so your podcast, you've got a couple of podcasts.
Just one. So Archive Fever podcast. It's a really nerdy history podcast that I co-host with Claire Wright, another historian at La Trobe. It's about the process of research and archives, and our third season is launching in late October 2021.
Oh, brilliant!
Awesome.
Well, Eve, thank you so much.
Thank you. See you later.
So lovely to meet you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.